The day I'm posting this is the 23rd of November, which is Doctor Who Day, so I decided to finally get around to reviewing the latest season. I should explain, though, that my channel is not a Doctor Who fan channel. I'm just a hobbyist YouTuber. This is basically just my journal. I'll post about whatever's on my mind, and that will be Doctor Who when the mood takes me, sometimes more often than other times. But it's not a fan channel in the sense that I'm not posting a video about the show every single week, and I won't feel the need to react to things as soon as they happen. That's why I've decided to wait until Doctor Who Day to do a review of the latest season, just to let it set and to take a while to process what I really think of it. Now that we're several months removed, I've rewatched it and I've made notes, and I just wanted to talk about the thoughts I have on each episode and then the season as a whole. So beginning with episode 1, The Robot Revolution, I don't really have a lot to say about this one. Most of it is just set up for the story arc and the themes, and it introduces us to Belinda. The episode itself it's fine, it's a bit rushed. I get the impression that Russell T Davies had a lot of things on his mind that he wanted to write about, and about halfway through, the episode does sort of go up a gear and suddenly becomes about a lot more things than it was about during the first half, and I couldn't really tell exactly what it was that he was writing about. I thought it was a bit confusing. Also, the whole timey-wimey thing with the way that the chronology has worked out, that was explained very quickly, and I still don't really understand it, but I enjoyed the production design. I thought it had a very retro-futuristic look to it. But the problem is, I know that the episode is mostly just set up for a season that goes a bit off the rails towards the end. So I don't really know if I'll be watching the episode that many more times, unless there's a particular reason for it. Episode 2, Lux. This is a really odd one, and I am a bit conflicted on this, because as someone who has worked in a cinema, I did enjoy the 1950s American movie theatre setting. It's the way I like to imagine my local cinema being, even if it's not. And I think that the episode had a lot of appeal to me anyway, simply for that reason. I think going into this season, this was the one I was looking forward to the most, because I knew it was set in a 50s American movie theatre. But I think that the episode likes me more than I like it, because there is the scene in which, and I know that this is actually a false reality constructed by Lux to fool the Doctor and Belinda. I know that. But there is the scene in which the Doctor meets the fictional Doctor Who fans and discovers that he is actually a fictional character in a TV show. And I've got to say, a lot of other fans I've seen on the internet have really taken to that, and I think that's probably because they tend to have more of a sense of whimsy than I do. I just think it's a gimmick that stops the episode dead. Because isn't that exactly the sort of thing you do when you can't think of any other ideas for a Doctor Who episode? Let's have him maybe meet some Doctor Who fans and discover he's in a TV show and stuff, and there are lots of in-jokes about what the best episodes are and about, like, internet fan culture, and it completely brought the episode to a halt by not really being a proper episode. Like, I like Doctor Who for what it is. I don't need it to sort of be metatextual and to acknowledge me. I'm perfectly fine just being a viewer. I don't personally feel as though I need to be involved in the episode that much, and I know that this might just sound like me complaining over nothing, but it just came across as a very lazy way of getting a reaction from the fans, particularly from fans on the internet. And I'm not insulted by the way fans are depicted at all, because fandom can be like that sometimes. But I do find it. I actually do think it's a little bit condescending that Russell T Davies sort of didn't think he needed to write a proper script, if you know what I mean. That he could just throw something like that in there and that I'd like it, even though it's not actually a proper story. That he's acknowledging the viewer. It just came across as a very cheap way of getting a reaction. And also, the fact that it's a false reality created by looks means that it is essentially a dream sequence anyway. Like, when people will bring up that scene in the episode as an example of why they don't like the episode for reasons I've explained, often the reaction to that will be, but that isn't really what was happening though, you see, because it was a false reality created by looks to fool the Doctor. Yes, but that's even worse though, because that means that it's not even really happening in the episode anyway. It's just a dream sequence, so it's totally pointless. And maybe it wouldn't necessarily be such a bad scene if it were at least a family of fans, adults with children, rather than just cringe adults like they're college students. Because I know the Doctor Who would do this in the 80s, particularly with things like The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, but that was sort of metatextual in a thematic sense, rather than it actually just being very metatextual in a literal way. That was very unsubtle. I think there's a fine line between parodying your own fans and just mocking them, and I don't think that Davies gets the balance quite right, especially because a lot of that scene is just so Davies can sort of parody his own online trolls in order to then hit back at them, but all that's going to do is just validate them. And I think the problem is that one of the main differences between RTD1 and RTD2 is the way that now there's social media, and that Russell T Davies does use it. I think that's a problem because it is influencing his scripts too much. He's letting what people are writing about him online influence what goes into his scripts, and as a result, he just ends up lowering himself to their level. Like, I learned to not do this a long time ago because I've grown up with the internet, but because it's a relatively new thing to people of his age, I don't think he's really gone through that process yet of learning to just ignore it and to not lower yourself to their level. Because that's always just going to make things even worse, because they don't care if you hit back, they'll just keep going even more. The only purpose of that scene is just for Davies to respond to a small group of hecklers online. And I'm not one of them, and almost nobody watching is one of them, so it's like he's wasting our time just to hit back at a small group of hecklers at the back. And it's just very irritating to me. And I don't feel embarrassed watching it personally, but I do actually feel a little bit embarrassed for him that he wrote that scene into an actual script and thought, yeah, let's make this, let's broadcast this. And even though it's only one scene in the episode, I do think it's the sort of thing that actually brings down the entire episode with it. The rest of the episode is actually pretty good, but I feel like that one scene is actually so bad that it sort of ruins the whole thing for me. And I don't know if that's a fair reaction to have, but now that I'm several months removed from having watched it the first time, going back to it, watching it the second time, that's the reaction I had. And I think that scene is probably a microcosm of everything that I personally don't like about RTD2, because all it does is just reveal the kind of writer that he is. That's all it does. And I know that he clearly intended it to be a parody of toxic fandom on the internet, all he really ended up doing is just parodying himself instead. Episode 3, The Well. Now, this is the episode that is defined by the fact that it's the return of the Midnight Entity, and that caused a bit of debate as to whether or not it should have been a Midnight sequel, or should it have just been its own thing? Should the enemy of the episode have just been an original character or concept? I know that Davies has explained that as he was writing it, he realised the main enemy was too similar to the Midnight Entity for it to not be that. So he decided to make it the Midnight Entity because it was so similar that he thought it would be compared with the Midnight Entity. And this is despite the fact that it doesn't resemble the Midnight Entity at all. It doesn't behave like the Midnight Entity does in any way. It's essentially a different creature altogether, and it wasn't originally intended to be that, so he wasn't really writing it with that in mind. But then for some reason he decided that it's too similar for it to be the Midnight Entity, so he made it the Midnight Entity. And I don't really understand why that is. And I think the only reason in the episode that it actually is the Midnight Entity is because we are told that it is. If he had decided to not have that one moment in there where the Doctor finds out the planet used to be called Midnight, and so never actually learns that what he's facing is the Midnight Entity again, would the episode have actually been better? Because then we would have been talking about the episode for what it is, rather than for the fact that it's a secret sequel to what is arguably the best episode Russell T Davies ever wrote. And I do think that sort of became the main thing about the episode, despite the fact that really the episode is pretty good. It's a very claustrophobic outer space thriller. Those are always my favourite kind of episodes, like ones with like outer space colonists and spacesuits and things, where it's not necessarily fun. It's slightly on the darker, more dramatic side. I do like those kind of episodes, but with The Well, it just turns out to be a Midnight sequel, and that isn't necessarily what it should have been. And I think that sort of works against the episode. The fact that he decided to throw one extra thing in there, whereas actually I think what he had already was good enough for what it was. I do wonder whether it would have been more effective to actually not explain what it is, and then let the fan theorists debate whether or not it could be connected with the Midnight Entity. Because the thing about the Midnight Entity is that it was so dramatic because it wasn't explained, and that maybe if he had left the creature in this episode as something that wasn't explained, it could have had the same impact as Midnight without having to actually directly be connected to Midnight. Would it have been more effective for him to make a spiritual successor rather than a direct sequel? Because when mysteries are explained, the explanation can devalue the mystery. That was the great thing about Midnight, and it's like he didn't really remember that when he wrote The Well. I think that the return of the Midnight Entity overshadows the rest of an episode that maybe could have been better if it weren't held back by the return of a monster that no one was asking to see again because it was such a great one-off villain. And if he hadn't made that one decision, I do wonder whether or not The Well would have a better reputation. It is generally, from what I have gathered, it is generally considered the best episode of the season. I would not agree with that, actually. But I do think maybe he should have just left it as it was instead of adding that one extra thing into the mix that sort of became such a big deal that it overshadowed everything else in a way that wasn't necessarily a good thing. Episode 4, Lucky Day. This is a real mixed bag. And I really can't decide what I think of it. I can't tell whether or not I like the episode just because I already dislike what Conrad is supposed to represent. Is it just because this episode is telling me what I want to hear, rather than because it's well written? Do I like what it's saying, even if it's not necessarily saying it well? Because if that is it, doesn't that defeat the whole point of the episode, of it being about like echo chambers and things? Because it's not very complex. I think the way Pete McTeague depicts its subject matter is very simplified, where it's basically like good people versus bad people, and I don't think that's how things work in the real world. Is it really that simple in real life? I don't know. Is it because that was the only way that Pete McTeague could write about that subject? Again, I don't know, but it seems very dramatic in a way that isn't very nuanced. It's possible that I'm actually giving too much credit to real-world examples of Conrad. I could be doing that. Maybe I am. I don't know. But the thing is, I do think Jonah Hauer-King is a great actor, because he has to sell essentially two different characters in the same episode. He has to sell the really overly sentimentalized, idealized, kind of perfect, soft, vulnerable boyfriend that doesn't really exist in real life, but still has to be believably someone who actually really is that, who you could potentially meet, even if we don't really believe we ever could. And he also has to sell the distrustful, bad faith actor, internet troll, conspiracy theorist who's unhinged and dangerous and has a lot of dangerous stuff going off in his mind. And there are plenty of examples of that in real life. So in one sense, he's playing a very idealized character who we'd like to think would exist, but no, probably doesn't. And then he also has to sell a person who we've encountered plenty of times in real life. All he has to do is just be as believably like those people. So in a sense, one of them is the ideal and the other one is the reality. And I think that Jonah Hauer-King sells that perfectly. I think he's one of the best actors they've ever cast in the series. I think he's a very good eye actor. He can sort of switch between different emotions just by doing very subtle things with his eyes that reveal what's going on in his head. And I think he's a very gifted actor when it comes to that. And also Millie Gibson really sells it as well, because the first half of the episode is kind of like a sort of Richard Curtis rom-com, and the second half is more of a sort of action thriller, psychological horror kind of thing, and she has to sell both of those. I think that their chemistry together is brilliant, and I think that they both sell it perfectly. But a part of me wonders whether or not their acting elevates a script that on the page isn't very good. My heart likes this episode a lot, but my brain is actually very skeptical. So that's why I'm so conflicted on this. I think maybe the script is good, but it's a good script for a bad story, if that makes sense. I think Pete McTeague did a good job, but the job he did wasn't necessarily the right job. I know that this caused a lot of debate over its politics and stuff, and I do understand that. That in a sense, if you think about it, Conrad, he does kind of have a point, but the morality of the script is very much against him, despite the fact that in the real world, you can see where he's coming from when it comes to like big, powerful institutions. Should we really trust them? That's presented as being a very distrustful way of thinking, even though I don't think that's necessarily a bad attitude to have, because there are a lot of big, powerful institutions that we shouldn't necessarily trust that are saying one thing, like given the official truth, should we necessarily believe it? And yet the episode presents him as being inherently wrong to think that. So I don't really know. It's a very mixed message, but I can't really figure out exactly what Pete McTeague was trying to say. But I think that Millie Gibson and Jonah Hauer-King sold the episode anyway, and I think even though it's not necessarily a very good episode, they made it watchable, and they made it maybe more watchable than it would have been with other actors, and I think they have given the script better acting than it was asking for. So I want to say I like it, but I don't actually know if I do. I really, really don't know what I think about this one. It might take a couple of more watches to really figure that out. Episode 5 is The Story in the Engine, and this episode is a total mess, right? It's written by a playwright, by Inua Elams, and it's obvious that he's a playwright because it's like he's basically just written a play, but doesn't really understand the differences between writing for the stage and writing for the screen, because most of the episode is just people saying exposition to each other, and just sort of explaining their characters and their backstories at each other. And that can work for a 2-hour play, but when it's a 50-minute episode, that requires everything to be very condensed. There's a lot of different characters, and there's a lot of backstories, and there are a lot of things that are revealed, but it's all very compacted into a very short runtime, and I found it quite difficult to follow. And it was like the characters themselves don't have enough time to actually tell the story, so they are also rushing through it. The script is more like lots of information rather than an actual plot. We're told lots of things, but it's not really structured into a proper narrative. And it all became very difficult to follow because most of the story has already happened off-screen before the episode starts. And so the episode just consists of characters making references to those off-screen events that have already happened. And I thought that was a really weird choice to make. I didn't really understand that at all. A lot of information gets dumped, but there's so much of it, and it's all released very quickly throughout the episode. I couldn't really tell you much about any of the characters. They're never really given a proper introduction. I couldn't really tell you their names. I don't really know what actually happened, and I couldn't describe the plot because it's so needlessly convoluted, and I was really confused for most of the running time. I really, really didn't understand this episode at all. Alright, so episode 6 is the Interstellar Song Contest, and I think, actually, that this is the best episode of the season. In fact, it's probably the best episode of any 15th Doctor season, if not the entire RTD2 era. This episode is everything I love about Doctor Who in one single episode, because I don't really like Eurovision, but it is a perfect match for Doctor Who when you think about it, because both of them are about glitz and high camp and flashing lights and music and weird costumes, and you never really know what you're gonna get. Both shows have the same kind of chaotic, vibrant energy to them, and it turns out that making an episode that combines both of those things brought out all of that in Doctor Who and then turned it up to the max, and I really loved it. Also, it wasn't just like the excitement and just the style of it, it was also the emotionality as well, because you take Kid, who is played by Freddie Fox, an actor who I love, and I was thrilled when I found out that he had joined the cast of this season. Even though I can't condone what he was trying to do, like commit genocide on a mass scale, Freddie Fox really sold the character, And I really understood the pain that he felt because of what he had experienced, because of the way the corporation had treated him and what they had done to his planet, and the fact that they were now just profiting from that. I really connected with it, but also the song that Cora performs. The first time I watched this episode, that song reduced me to tears. And actually, it reduced me to tears the second time I watched it as well. I really love that scene where she sings, because I could feel the loss of her world, and I could feel how much that song meant to her. Especially with the very brief flashbacks to that planet and its landscapes and its continents and its sky. I was fully invested, and what Juno Dawson managed to do was, over the course of just one episode, she introduced new characters, managed to develop them enough for me to care about them that much by the end of the episode, and to understand why they were doing what they were doing, to be able to relate to them, but to also be able to see a sense of perspective of the whole thing. That's the assignment that Doctor Who writers have. Introduce new characters in this episode, develop them all, make us care about them over the course of that one episode, and get us to understand why each of them are doing what they're doing, and their different points of view. That's what makes Doctor Who much harder to write than most other shows. But Juno Dawson nailed it on her first go. And I hope that... I personally wouldn't pick her as showrunner, because she has, almost no actual TV experience. I think this might have been her first teleplay, possibly. But I hope that she's invited back for the next season, whoever the head writer is. I really love this episode, and RTD2 as a whole mostly hasn't worked for me. But the Interstellar Song Contest is a rare exception to that. And, I think this might even be on par with the average RTD1 episode. That's how good I think it is. Episode 7 is Wish World, and this is the first part of the two-part finale, and it only really seems to exist just for the cliffhanger, rather than the cliffhanger actually setting up the second half of a proper story. Rather than part 1 being part 1 of a story, it's like it only really exists just to have the cliffhanger, rather than the cliffhanger being something that happens in the middle of whatever story is happening anyway. And I think that's a big flaw in the episode. So, thinking about the plot, Rani gives Desiderium to Conrad so that he can use Desiderium's wish-granting powers to wish his ideal reality into existence. Okay, why did the Rani just happen to choose Conrad? The only reason, as far as I can tell, is because Russell T Davies wanted to have a minor villain from earlier in the season come back for the finale. So the Rani chooses Conrad because Conrad is a supporting character from earlier in the season, even though the only reason he was introduced earlier in the season is just so he could return for the finale. But the reason given for him coming back in the finale is that the Rani chose him for no particular reason. And I just don't really understand why he was actually there in the story. I understand that he was introduced in Lucky Day so that he then comes back for the finale. I get that. But actually within the story, why does the Rani choose him? It's like he's only there just because of the plan for the season, even though the story doesn't actually give a proper reason. Just because that's what the plan was. But within the story, though, there is no reason for it. And also, his ideology doesn't really make any sense, because in Wish World, right, which is designed by Conrad based on his ideal reality, disabled people are invisible and have no support, and also homosexuality is bad, right? But people of other religions are there, like the Chandra family, and people of colour are there, like Belinda and Ibrahim, and they're included, and they're equal to everybody else. So, disabled people, bad. Homosexuality, bad. Other religions, fine. People of colour, fine. And it's just very inconsistent. I didn't really understand, like, okay, so why are these people bad, but these other people aren't bad? Because all of them are minorities, but why are only certain minorities bad and other minorities aren't? I couldn't really explain that, because Conrad is clearly supposed to represent a certain political ideology, but what is it? Like, he definitely is supposed to represent something, maybe, but he also doesn't really represent anything in particular. Like, when Russell T Davies wrote this episode, he clearly had something to say, kinda, but also kinda didn't have anything to say. It's a dystopia for some people, but not for other people. And some of the people that you'd think would be treated badly in this world aren't. I just didn't really understand that. But also, it doesn't matter anyway, because the only point of Wishworld is so the Doctor can realise it's not real, because his doubt, amplified by the Vindicator somehow, cracks open reality so the Rani can free Omega from the underworld. I mean, I can follow it, but it just seems very needlessly complicated. And the only reason for it that I can figure out is that it was just a way of creating a big spectacular cliffhanger. As though Davies thought of the cliffhanger first, and then worked backwards to reverse engineer a reason for the cliffhanger to happen, rather than the cliffhanger happening as the result of something that's in the story. Instead, the story we get is just a series of events to set up the cliffhanger happening, even though actually nothing leading up to it makes that much sense when you think about it. Like, why is Conrad's ideology so weird? That he hates disabled people and he hates gay people, but he's fine with Hindus and people of colour. That's just really weird to me. And the Rani's plan is so needlessly complicated. I mean, it's kind of like an allegory for the average Russell T Davies episode. And I think this is true of RTD1 as well, although to less of an extent. Which is that it's very nice, just don't express any doubt. And finally, we come to episode 8, The Reality War. Now, I have to say, watching this the second time around, I didn't hate it as much as I did the first time around. I think as a finale, the approach that Russell T Davies takes to it is that he set up so many plot points. All he really does is just clear the table, essentially. Nothing really happens. He's just putting his action figures away and getting rid of them as soon as he can. That's why we get the Rani being devoured by Omega without the Doctor having to do anything. It's like he had set up so many different plot points and characters that he didn't really know what to do with them once they were all there together. So the Rani is just eaten by one of the other villains, and the Doctor just stands there, doesn't have to do anything, and then Mrs. Flood escapes using the Rani's time ring, also without the Doctor having to do anything. And I can't think of another finale in which the main villains are defeated without the Doctor having to do anything. It was just really odd to me that the Doctor actually didn't have to do anything. The Rani problem just ended up taking care of itself because her plan backfired. So he could just sort of sit back and watch. And obviously, though, that's because of what Omega turns out to be, which is just a generic CGI monster. But then the Doctor just sends him back into the underworld by improvising a weapon out of the Vindicator somehow. The Vindicator seems to just be a sort of do-anything device in this season. You know, like the Rani can use it to amplify the power of the Doctor's doubt, to crack open reality and open the underworld, and then the Doctor can just improvise it into a big laser gun to defeat Omega with it. It's just really weird that it's just a sort of do what you need to plot device. I mean, I know that RTD has been guilty of that in the past a lot, but I noticed it a lot more with this season's finale in particular, the way that one thing can just be used to do practically whatever is needed. I mean, because that big bone creature, it's not like it was a very interesting villain, so I don't have a problem with it being defeated almost as soon as it arrives. The problem is that it's supposed to be Omega, particularly because we get him name-dropped at the end of the previous episode, so there was a whole week of build-up to it, and I think that's what is so disappointing, that it was just not the thing we were told it would be. Had it not been called Omega, I don't think it would necessarily be a problem. If he had just called it like the Underworld Abomination or something, that would have been fine, you know. The problem isn't that it's just a big CGI monster, it's that we were told to expect something that we didn't really get. It's like calling the thing in the well the Midnight Entity. Do you need to just sort of slap that onto it, like a post-it note, just to tell us to think that's what it is? The reality war is sort of an amplification of that. Just slap a post-it note on it and tell us that's what it is, when it's clearly not that. And if it weren't that, people wouldn't be expecting it to be that. You know? I don't think the whole sort of CGI monster bone thing would have necessarily been as much of a problem, but Russell T Davies told us that it's Omega. But that's only because he says it is. It's like he's sort of telling us things rather than actually making us able to believe it. If you're saying it's Omega, we actually have to be able to believe that. Kind of like the thing in the well. It has to actually act like the Midnight Entity for us to believe that it really is that, instead of it just being something else that you've decided to say is the Midnight Entity. And I think that's been a big problem with this season, with him just telling us to think of something as being one thing that it's not. I think because he knows that it generates hype and interest without him necessarily having to do anything. And I think that's been a big problem with Season 2. Had he not called it Omega, nothing would have had to change in the script. The Rani could have just wanted to unleash the underworld monster thing for whatever reason, but the script wouldn't have really needed to change. The plot would have been exactly the same, but for some reason he decided to say Omega just because he wanted it to be like one recognizable thing extra. Like, just having the Rani there wasn't enough. It's like he just wanted to have that one extra thing we recognize the name of more. And I think that was a problem of him trying to just go that one extra step, and it was just a terrible decision, despite the fact that it doesn't actually change the plot in any way, so what was the point of it? But again, Omega, or whatever it is dispatched almost as soon as he arrives, just like the Rani, because this is Russell just, now that he's got his action figures out, he's putting them away, and he's got a lot of stuff to deal with, so he's just getting rid of things as quickly as possible, rather than there being a real story, like Conrad. Ruby uses Desiderium's wish powers to give Conrad a nice life, and so he then just disappears. And I don't actually blame Ruby for that, because the whole point of being the Doctor's companion is that you try to find a better way instead of just killing them or taking revenge. And I think it would have been out of character for Ruby to try and take her revenge. But it does seem as though that only happens because it was the simplest way of getting the character out of the picture, because there are so many other things to be dealing with. Had Conrad just been the main villain, I'm sure that wouldn't have happened, but the fact that there was Conrad and the Rani and Omega, all of them are just dispatched very quickly because there are so many different things to be dealing with, and he clearly doesn't really know how to include them all in one coherent plot, so he just sort of wipes the slate, just sort of clears the table. This episode is just him clearing the table as quickly as he can, because after 7 episodes of build-up, all we actually get is just name drops, references, and flashbacks. And that's the issue. Nothing really happens. It's a long episode, there's a lot of action, but really when you think about it, nothing actually happens. Not really. I don't think this episode is a mess. I think it's actually deceptively simple. I just think that it's a bit lackluster. Now, there is the whole thing with the third act that happened because of all the reshoots, and I am still a bit confused over the actual plot because of all the retcons that had to be added in for the reshoots. I have to say though, I couldn't tell when the reshot scenes actually began. I'm sure if I had been specifically watching out for it, I might have been able to tell, but when I was watching it the second time, it seemed more seamless than it did before, but I still don't understand what the real timeline is. What is the proper version of Belinda's life? I still can't follow it. I still can't tell if it's a retcon or if it's a reveal. I actually have no idea what the proper version of her life really is, and I think that's so confusing that if we ever see Belinda in the expanded universe again, it's only going to be during her adventures with the Doctor. I don't think we're ever going to actually get Belinda coming back after the events of the reality war, because which version of her life is the proper one is so unclear that I think it's just a big continuity mine. I have no idea what the actual proper version of her life is. That's the really big problem. I have no idea what that proper version of her life is, which means I have no idea about her as a character. It's like the character barely exists at all. She's probably the most poorly written companion in the entire show for that one reason, that the reality war just messes things up and makes things so confusing that as a character she doesn't really exist, because she gets unravelled and unwritten, and it's such a huge mess that I just find it easier not to think about it, which shouldn't really be my reaction. But also, I don't understand why Poppy was even in Wishworld to begin with, because Poppy is a real character in this universe, because she's in Space Babies, but then Belinda has a vision of her in the story and the engine, and for some reason she's real in Wishworld. But why did Poppy appear in Wishworld? What was the reason for that? Is there ever a reason given? I honestly have no idea. What was she doing there? I really don't know. The reality war manages to make every episode that led up to it so incoherent that they should just put red tape around the whole season and say, you know what? Don't do anything involving any of these characters or storylines in the future, because it's just such a mess. We don't know. There's been such a mess made in this season. Just don't go anywhere near it. Just ignore it, because it makes no sense. And I think that's the worst thing about this episode. It managed to make the other episodes of the season make no sense retrospectively. This episode, it's not exactly a train wreck. It's not a disaster. It's just a very loud and very flashy and very confusing nothing burger. And I can't explain most of the creative decisions, if any of them. But I think Season 2 is probably going to go down as one of the most confusing, if not the most confusing storylines in all of Doctor Who, because the last episode manages to retroactively make everything that led up to it totally incomprehensible. In just one episode, that's kind of an achievement. The story arc is almost exactly the same as Season 1's, because in Season 1 you had an Angel of Death appearing in each episode, and all of them were portrayed by the same actor. Whereas in Season 2, it's literally the same character appearing in every episode. And it's so similar to the previous season, and I can't think of any other time that this has been done, in which the story arc of a season is almost identical to the story arc from the previous season, and it's not even addressed. If there is another season, hopefully it'll be better, hopefully. And it's not like I don't have the other parts of the show that I do like that I can still watch. That's what separates me from certain other people on the internet. If I personally don't enjoy the latest season, well, hopefully the next one will be better. I still have the episodes that I do like that I can watch. So, sometimes life is disappointing. Overreacting to it won't change anything. There isn't going to be a season in 2026, so for next year's Doctor Who Day, I might have to review The War Between the Land and the Sea. And that's released next month, so if I do that, then I'll have had almost a whole year to process it and decide what I think of it, which is always a good thing. I've no interest in reacting to things as soon as they happen. I'm not one of those kind of channels. I could get more views if I do that, but that's not the kind of channel that I run. And then the actual next episode of Doctor Who will be the Christmas special in 2026. I may do a video about that this Christmas, a whole year in advance, summarising my expectations. I don't know, though. It will depend on whether or not I think I have an interesting enough angle.